January 27, 1941. Kagoshima Bay, southern Japan. Captain Fumio Aoki stands on the deck of a torpedo testing vessel, watching another failure splash into the bay. The modified Type 91 torpedo hits the water at the prescribed angle, penetrates the surface cleanly, and then plunges 75 feet straight down before its gyroscope can correct the dive angle. In shallow water operations, that depth would mean the torpedo embedding itself in mud and sand, its 450-pound warhead wasted on sediment instead of American steel. Aoki makes a note on his clipboard. Test number 47. Failure, like the previous 46 attempts. Behind him, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto watches in silence. The commander of the combined fleet has been watching these tests for 3 months. Every test has ended the same way. The torpedo diving too deep, too fast, rendering it useless for the specific tactical problem Yamamoto has been obsessing over since early 1940. The laws of physics, Aoki says quietly, don't accommodate ambition, Admiral. Yamamoto doesn't respond immediately. He's staring across Kagoshima Bay, chosen specifically because its depth profile roughly matches Pearl Harbor, Oahu, territory of Hawaii. 40 to 45 feet of water. Shallow enough to protect against conventional torpedo attack, deep enough to host the entire U.S. Pacific Fleet. Every navy in the world understood the same tactical reality. Torpedo attacks required deep water. A standard aerial torpedo, dropped from an aircraft traveling 200-plus knots at optimal altitude, would plunge 80 to 120 feet before its stabilization systems brought it level for a horizontal attack run. The torpedo's entry velocity, its weight, its hydrodynamic profile, all of these factors combined to create an unavoidable initial dive that required substantial water depth to accommodate. Pearl Harbor averaged 40 feet deep across most of its anchorage areas. The U.S. Navy had specifically chosen Pearl Harbor as the Pacific Fleet's primary base because shallow water made it functionally immune to torpedo attack. Battleships could be moored in rows, Battleship Row, with confidence that enemy aerial torpedoes would simply bury themselves in the harbor bottom before reaching attack depth. The American calculation was simple, logical, and accepted by every major navy. You can't torpedo ships in shallow harbors. Physics doesn't allow it. But Yamamoto had been planning to do exactly that for over a year. The strategic problem that couldn't be solved. The concept of attacking Pearl Harbor didn't originate with Yamamoto. Japanese naval strategists had been gaming out a Pacific War with the United States since the 1920s. Every war plan, every strategic scenario, every operational concept started with the same assumption. Japan needed to neutralize the U.S. Pacific Fleet immediately. If war came, American battleships would steam westward from Hawaii and engage the Imperial Japanese Navy in a decisive fleet action somewhere in the western Pacific. Japan's numerical disadvantage, fewer battleships, fewer carriers, smaller industrial base, meant that a conventional fleet-on-fleet battle carried enormous risk. The Americans could replace losses. Japan could not. A single catastrophic battle could end Japan's naval power permanently. But what if the U.S. Pacific Fleet never left Pearl Harbor? What if Japan could destroy American battleships while they sat at anchor, protected by the shallow water that made them theoretically invulnerable to torpedo attack? The idea had seemed insane when Yamamoto first proposed it in early 1940. Every naval officer who reviewed the plan identified the same insurmountable obstacle. Torpedoes don't work in 40 feet of water. The British had demonstrated this at Taranto, Italy, in November 1940, attacking Italian battleships in Taranto Harbor. But Taranto averaged 90 feet deep, more than twice Pearl Harbor's depth. The British torpedo attack had been spectacular. It had also been physically impossible to replicate at Pearl Harbor, given the depth limitations. American naval intelligence knew about Taranto. They understood its implications. But they also understood that Taranto's success depended on water depth that Pearl Harbor simply didn't have. An internal U.S. Navy assessment from December 1940 had concluded, enemy torpedo attack on fleet units in Pearl Harbor is considered highly improbable due to shallow water conditions. Yamamoto read that assessment, intercepted and translated by Japanese intelligence, with grim satisfaction. The Americans believed they were safe. That belief would be their undoing if Yamamoto could solve the physics problem that protected them. The engineer who refused to accept impossible. Captain Fumio Aoki was not a typical naval officer. He had trained as a mechanical engineer before entering the Imperial Japanese Navy. He understood torpedoes not as weapons, but as hydrodynamic systems governed by physical laws that could be manipulated if you understood them thoroughly enough. When Yamamoto approached him in late 1940 with the Pearl Harbor problem, Aoki's initial response had been identical to every other torpedo specialist. It can't be done. A torpedo dropped from attack altitude and velocity would dive to at least 80 feet depth. There was no way around the physics of momentum, water resistance, and stabilization time required for the torpedo to level off. But Yamamoto had made a specific request. Don't tell me why it's impossible. Tell me what would need to change to make it possible. Aoki spent 3 weeks analyzing the problem from first principles. The torpedo's initial dive was caused by 3 factors. First, momentum. The torpedo was traveling at high velocity when it hit the water. That forward and downward momentum carried it deep before drag forces could slow it enough for the stabilization fins to take effect. Second, hydrodynamic profile. The torpedo's streamlined shape was optimized for underwater speed and range. But that same streamlined design provided minimal resistance during the initial water entry, allowing it to penetrate deep before stabilization could occur. Third, stabilization delay. The torpedo's internal gyroscope and control surfaces needed time to detect the dive and correct for it. During that correction period, approximately 2 to 3 seconds, the torpedo continued diving. Conventional torpedo design accepted these factors as immutable. Torpedoes needed to be fast, streamlined, and stable. Those requirements produced weapons that dove deep on initial water entry. Deep water operations accommodated this. Shallow water operations did not. But Aoki identified a 4th factor that conventional designs had never needed to consider. Water entry profile could be altered if you changed the torpedo's cross-sectional area during the critical first seconds of water entry. The insight was simple but revolutionary. If you increased the torpedo's surface area dramatically at the moment of water impact, you would increase water resistance exponentially. Higher resistance meant faster deceleration. Faster deceleration meant less depth penetration before the stabilization systems engaged. The question was how to increase surface area without compromising the torpedo's aerodynamic profile during the drop and without permanently altering its underwater performance after it had reached attack depth. The wooden solution, and why it seemed insane. Aoki's solution was almost comically simple: attach wooden fins to the torpedo's tail assembly. Large wooden stabilizers that would increase the tail's cross-sectional area by approximately 300%. The wood would provide enormous water resistance on impact, dramatically slowing the torpedo's initial dive. But wood, unlike metal, would shear away under the hydraulic stress of water impact, leaving the torpedo's standard metal fins intact for its attack run. The concept was so counterintuitive that when Aoki first presented it to his engineering team, the response was immediate skepticism. "Sir, with respect," said Lieutenant Katsura, Aoki's senior design engineer, "you're describing military ordnance made of wood. That's not innovation. That's regression to primitive technology. We have metal, we have steel, we use them." "Primitive technology," Aoki replied calmly, "solves problems that modern technology can't address. The wooden fins have one job: dissipate kinetic energy on water impact and then disintegrate. Metal can't do that efficiently. Wood can. Another engineer, Commander Sotaro, shook his head. The precision required to engineer wooden components that break at exactly the right moment, under exactly the right stresses. It's manufacturing science fiction. How do you ensure consistent failure? How do you test for it? Aoki's calculations suggested it would work, but calculations were theoretical. Reality was unforgiving. Manufacturing precision on wooden components that had to break predictably was a problem nobody had ever solved before. Still, there was no alternative. The war timeline was accelerating. Yamamoto needed an answer. Aoki began the testing program. 47 failures, and the anatomy of one. The first test, conducted in November 1940, was a catastrophic failure. The wooden fins didn't break away cleanly. Instead, they partially splintered, creating asymmetric drag that threw the torpedo into an uncontrolled spiral. The weapon veered 40 degrees off course and buried itself in the bay floor 200 meters from the intended target. Aoki reviewed the debris. The wood had fractured, but not uniformly. The pressure had been too concentrated at specific stress points. The wooden fins needed a different design. Tests 2 through 7 explored different wood densities. Japanese cedar was too soft. It compressed under impact rather than breaking cleanly, absorbing energy but failing to separate from the torpedo body. Oak was too rigid and shattered unpredictably, creating sharp fragments that could damage the torpedo's body. Bamboo splinters created aerodynamic turbulence that destabilized the entire weapon. Tests 8 through 15 focused on attachment mechanisms. Bolts created discrete stress points where all pressure concentrated, causing explosive failure patterns that threw the torpedo violently off course. Adhesives failed under the hydraulic forces, the fins simply peeling away mid-water, useless. Wire bindings worked in theory, but added weight that altered the torpedo's flight characteristics and slowed its entry velocity. By test number 15, Aoki realized the fundamental problem. The wooden fins had to break apart, not all at once in a catastrophic failure, but in a controlled sequence. They had to absorb kinetic energy gradually, slowing the torpedo progressively, rather than creating shock loads that destabilized it. Tests 16 through 31 explored laminated wood structures, plywood with specific grain orientations, layered bamboo and cedar combinations designed to fracture predictably under calculated stress. Test number 23 was particularly instructive. Aoki used 5-ply plywood with alternating grain directions. When dropped, the fins took the impact and began separating, but slowly, layer by layer. The torpedo's initial dive was reduced to 55 feet. Significant progress, but not sufficient for 40-foot Pearl Harbor operations. Tests 32 through 46 brought marginal improvements. Each modification yielded 3 to 5 feet of additional shallow water performance. Each new design created new problems: drag, stability, fragmentation patterns. By January 1941, after 46 tests, Aoki had achieved approximately 48 feet of shallow water penetration, 8 feet deeper than required for Pearl Harbor operations, but moving in the right direction. The engineering team was exhausted. The manufacturing precision required had proven almost impossible to achieve consistently. Different wooden samples responded differently to impacts. Laminations split unexpectedly. Attachment points failed in ways that defied prediction. Commander Sotaro approached Aoki after Test 46. "Captain, we've made progress, but I'm not certain the problem is actually solvable. Perhaps Admiral Yamamoto should be informed that Pearl Harbor operations may need to proceed without torpedo attack capability. We have bombs. We have level bombers. We can still cause significant damage." Aoki didn't respond immediately. He was staring at the water where Test 46 had disappeared, analyzing the splash pattern, calculating angles and velocities in his mind with the obsessive precision that had defined his engineering career. Test 48. The final calculation. Standing on the deck in Kagoshima Bay, Aoki finally spoke to Yamamoto. "I know what went wrong on Test 47, he said. "The lamination pattern was incorrect. I was thinking about the wooden fins as a single solid structure that needed to fail. I should have been thinking about them as an array of discrete elements that fail sequentially, each one shedding energy at a specific moment in the deceleration sequence." Yamamoto looked at him for a long moment. Around them, the testing crew waited in silence. The admiral knew the mathematics. Japan's timeline was compressing. The Pacific War would begin soon. If Pearl Harbor was going to be attacked with torpedoes, that decision needed to be finalized within days. "One more test, Captain Aoki," Yamamoto said quietly. "If Test 48 fails, we abandon the torpedo element of the Pearl Harbor plan. We proceed with bombs only, and we accept that American battleships may survive the attack. But if Test 48 succeeds—" He paused, looking out across Kagoshima Bay toward the horizon. "If Test 48 succeeds, Japan has a weapon that changes everything." Aoki nodded. He was already sketching modifications on his clipboard. This time, he wasn't thinking about the fins breaking. He was thinking about them breaking in stages. The fate of the Pearl Harbor attack, and possibly the entire Pacific War, depended on whether a Japanese engineer could make wooden fins break in exactly the right sequence, at exactly the right moments, under forces that had defied calculation for months. The test would occur at dawn. Yamamoto had ordered the entire Japanese Naval Aviation Command to be present for observation. Test 48 would determine whether physics could be bent to accommodate strategy, or whether strategy would have to accept the limitations that physics imposed. Either way, Japan's future was being decided on the deck of a torpedo testing vessel in Kagoshima Bay, where Captain Fumio Aoki was sketching wooden fins that might change the course of history. February 15, 1941, Kagoshima Bay. Dawn. The sky is the pale gray of pre-dawn, not quite dark, not yet light. The testing crew has been assembled since 0530 hours. 43 officers and technical personnel, representing every major division of Japanese naval aviation, stand along the testing platform. Admiral Yamamoto is present, as is Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commander of the 1st Air Fleet. This test carries the weight of empire. Captain Aoki stands at a small table covered with blueprints and sketches. Next to the blueprints lies a single torpedo equipped with his latest modification. Wooden tail fins constructed from 5-ply laminated birch, with grain orientation specifically designed to fracture in 3 distinct phases. Each phase would shed kinetic energy at precise moments during the torpedo's water entry sequence. Aoki hasn't slept in 36 hours. He's been running calculations, adjusting specifications, reviewing failed tests, looking for patterns. Somewhere in the mathematics of wood grain, attachment points, and water pressure dynamics, the answer existed. He had found it at 300 hours this morning, or at least he believed he had found it. Lieutenant Commander Sato approaches. "Captain, the wooden fins are ready for installation. Before we proceed, I should note that this design is unconventional. Some of the officers are questioning whether we should proceed with a test that might embarrass you publicly if it fails." Aoki doesn't look away from his calculations. If it fails, it fails. Better to fail here, in February, than to fail in December over Pearl Harbor. "You're very confident about this modification." "I'm not confident," Aoki says quietly. "I'm desperate. There's a difference. Desperation forces you to look beyond conventional thinking." The sun breaks over the bay. The water is calm, perfectly still. Ideal conditions for a torpedo test. Aoki nods to the launch crew. The modified torpedo is loaded into the release mechanism, a B-5N Kate torpedo bomber that has been modified to hold the weapon steady during a shallow dive. The aircraft will approach the test area at 200 knots, release the torpedo at approximately 200 feet altitude, and then climb away. The conditions exactly replicate what Japanese pilots would experience over Pearl Harbor. The geometry of breakdown. Most people don't understand how a torpedo's wooden fins were engineered to fail. They imagine simple wood that shatters on impact, leaving only the metal torpedo body behind. In reality, the destruction was precisely calculated. The outer layer of Aoki's wooden fins was constructed from grain-aligned birch, wood strong enough to hold the fins together during the aircraft's storage and release, but weak enough to begin fragmenting the moment the torpedo hit water at velocity. This initial fragmentation was critical. It had to happen in the first half-second of water impact before the full weight of deceleration forces could build. The second layer, the middle ply, was intentionally weaker than the outer layer. It was designed to separate from the outer layer as the outer layer disintegrated. This second layer separation created additional friction and drag, further slowing the torpedo's initial dive. The innermost layer was the strongest, constructed from compression grain bamboo. This layer would remain partially attached to the torpedo's tail body throughout the water entry sequence. It would flex, absorb energy, and finally separate completely once the torpedo's velocity had been reduced to the point where the internal gyroscope could maintain control. In theory, this three-stage separation would dissipate the incoming kinetic energy gradually rather than in shock waves. The torpedo would decelerate evenly. Its internal systems would have time to correct the dive angle before the hydrodynamic forces became unmanageable. In theory. Test number 48. At 06:47 hours, the B-5N Kate begins its approach run. The aircraft is piloted by Lieutenant Yamamoto, no relation to Admiral Yamamoto, though the coincidence has become something of a running joke among the test crew. Lieutenant Yamamoto is the best pilot the Imperial Japanese Navy has trained for torpedo bombing. His approach geometry is always perfect, his release timing flawless. The aircraft descends to 200 feet. Speed, 200 knots, all parameters nominal. The torpedo releases cleanly. The B-5N climbs away, banking toward the observation platform. Everyone watches in silence. The torpedo's trajectory is perfect, a 15-degree angle, descending rapidly toward the water. Aoki is calculating in his head, trying to predict the exact moment of water impact based on distance and velocity. 3 seconds. 2 seconds. 1. The impact. The wooden fins hit the water first. By design, they were positioned to absorb initial impact. The surface explodes upward in a spray. For a moment, the torpedo disappears completely into the spray cloud. The spray clears. The torpedo's trajectory has changed. Instead of continuing its deep 15-degree dive angle, it's pitching upward. The wooden fins are disintegrating, visible splinters spinning away from the torpedo body. But instead of tumbling, instead of losing control, the torpedo is actually rising through the water column. The angle flattens. 12 degrees. 10. 8. 6. At approximately 2 seconds into water entry, exactly as calculated, the torpedo levels off at approximately 38 feet depth. Perfect. Exactly what Pearl Harbor operations required. The torpedo continues its run at stabilized depth, racing across the test area toward a wooden target barge anchored 600 meters downrange. The impact is violent and immediate. The torpedo strikes the barge's wooden hull at full velocity, the explosion creating a column of water and splinters that rises 50 feet into the air. The barge sinks within seconds. Completely destroyed by a weapon that had been designed to penetrate shallow water that supposedly made such weapons impossible. The moment after success. In the silence that follows, Aoki feels his hands begin to shake. Not from fear, from the sudden release of 36 hours of tension compressed into a 2-second test sequence that had just validated months of impossible calculations. He had done it. He had bent physics to accommodate strategy. Admiral Yamamoto steps forward slowly, his expression unreadable. Around them, the testing crew remains motionless, processing what they've just witnessed. This wasn't just a successful weapons test. This was the moment when Japan's entire strategic position in the Pacific had shifted. Yamamoto places a hand on Aoki's shoulder. When he speaks, his voice is quiet, not triumphant, but weighted with understanding of what this success would cost. "Test 48 is successful, Captain," Yamamoto says. "You've given the Empire a weapon that changes everything. The Americans believe themselves safe because of physics. You've broken their physics." He pauses, looking out across the bay where the target barge had been moments before. "But remember this moment carefully, Aoki-san. The greatest weapon in war is often the one your enemy doesn't know exists. The moment they learn what we've done here today, they will never trust shallow harbors again. We have perhaps 6 months of advantage before someone talks, before intelligence leaks, before the Americans begin to suspect. We must make those 6 months count." Aoki nods slowly, understanding crystallizing. "Pearl Harbor must happen before they learn." "Pearl Harbor must happen," Yamamoto confirms, "before the Americans realize that their assumptions about shallow water were wrong. Once we attack, once our torpedoes work in 40 feet of water, every major navy in the world will begin redesigning their harbor defenses. But if we can destroy their Pacific fleet before that knowledge spreads—" He doesn't finish the sentence. He doesn't need to. The secret that must never be spoken. What happened next was unprecedented in the history of military innovation. Test 48 never happened. Officially. No photographs were taken, no official reports were filed with the Naval General Staff. The test was classified at a level above top secret, restricted to fewer than 30 people on Earth. The technicians who had witnessed the test were reassigned to isolated posts where they would have no contact with foreign intelligence services. The target barge's wreckage was recovered and destroyed to prevent any physical evidence from reaching American observers. Admiral Yamamoto understood immediately what was at stake. This test never happened. No one speaks of it. No one records it. Fewer than 30 people on Earth will ever know what occurred in Kagoshima Bay this morning. The fewer people who know, the better. Intelligence leaks happen through careless conversations, through overheard remarks in bars, through letters home that mention technical details casually. Every person who knows this secret is a potential security breach. The modified Type 91 torpedoes began production in March 1941 at the Kure Naval Arsenal under conditions of absolute secrecy. Workers were told they were producing standard torpedo modifications for extended-range operations. The wooden tail fins were manufactured separately by civilian contractors who believed they were producing aircraft components. Final assembly occurred in isolated facilities where workers had no access to external communications. Even the pilots who would use these weapons in combat wouldn't be told about the wooden fins until they were deployed over Pearl Harbor itself. They would train with standard torpedoes. They would practice shallow water approaches without understanding why. The tactical innovation would remain hidden until the moment it was used, when secrecy no longer mattered, because the attack had already succeeded. The training that changed everything. Word of Test 48's success spread through Japanese naval aviation quietly, not through official channels, but through the small conversations of officers, the private discussions of technical personnel, the inevitable rumors that flow through any military organization when something historic has occurred. By March 1941, torpedo bombing pilots were being quietly told to prepare for a special mission. They weren't given full details. They simply knew that shallow water operations were now possible and that they would be expected to master them. Lieutenant Mitsuo Fuchida, who would later command the Pearl Harbor airstrike, began receiving unusual training directives in early spring. Practice shallow angle approaches. Perfect release timing at 200 knots. Maintain formation discipline during low-altitude runs. The tactical parameters were specific and demanding, and entirely different from standard torpedo doctrine that emphasized deep-water operations. Fuchida asked his squadron commander why they were training for tactics that conventional wisdom said were impossible. Because, his commander said carefully, conventional wisdom is sometimes wrong. And when it's wrong, the side that recognizes it first wins the war. Flight drills intensified through summer 1941. Pilots practiced approaching targets in increasingly shallow water conditions. They learned the precise release altitude and velocity required to ensure their modified torpedoes would function correctly. They trained in the specific attack vectors that would allow them to penetrate American anti-aircraft defenses while positioning their aircraft for optimal torpedo release. Each practice run used the modified Type 91 torpedoes equipped with Aoki's wooden fins. Each run proved the design. Each successful attack deepened the pilot's confidence that the impossible was now possible. By August 1941, 6 months after Test 48, the Imperial Japanese Navy had perfected the shallow water torpedo attack. Every pilot in the First Air Fleet could execute the maneuver. Every torpedo in the arsenal had been equipped with wooden tail fins. The weapon that would devastate Pearl Harbor was ready. And America, still believing that shallow water provided absolute protection, was utterly unprepared for what would come. The fatal window. What Test 48 had created was a window of tactical advantage, but it was a window with a timer attached. The advantage would last only as long as American ignorance remained intact. The moment Pearl Harbor was attacked, the moment American salvage crews recovered torpedo fragments with wooden tail assemblies, the moment naval engineers analyzed the wreckage. That moment, every major navy in the world would understand that shallow water torpedo attacks were possible. Yamamoto understood this completely. Pearl Harbor wasn't just an attack, it was a gamble that required perfect timing. Attack too early before preparations were complete, and the strike might fail to achieve decisive damage. Attack too late, and American intelligence might discover the shallow water modification before the operation launched. The window was 6 months, perhaps 8, if security held perfectly. After that, the advantage would evaporate. Harbors would be redesigned. Defensive measures would be implemented. The tactical revolution that Aoki had created would be neutralized by enemy countermeasures. Test 48 had been a triumph of engineering. It had validated desperate innovation. It had been the moment when the physics of warfare shifted. But it had also started a countdown. Japan now possessed a weapon that could change the Pacific War, but only if that weapon was used before its existence became known. Standing on the observation platform in Kagoshima Bay, watching maintenance crews secure the testing equipment, Captain Fumio Aoki understood that he had solved the impossible problem. He had given Admiral Yamamoto the weapon that made Pearl Harbor tactically feasible. What he didn't understand, what he couldn't have known, was that solving the impossible problem had also created an impossible strategic dilemma. The shallow water torpedo would devastate the U.S. Pacific Fleet. But that devastation would trigger an American industrial response so overwhelming, so total, that Japan's initial tactical victory would become the catalyst for their ultimate strategic defeat. Test 48 had changed naval warfare forever. It had also sealed Japan's fate. December 6, 1941, 0600 hours, Japanese Carrier Task Force, proceeding east, 220 nautical miles north of Pearl Harbor. The morning is violent. The North Pacific in December is unforgiving. Waves towering 30 feet, wind gusting at 45 knots, visibility reduced to mere yards by driving rain and spray. The Japanese task force pitches and heaves through the chaos. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, the 4 fleet carriers that will make history, accompanied by Zuikaku and Shokaku, heavy cruisers, destroyers, and fleet submarines. Below decks on the Akagi, Lieutenant Mitsuo Fuchida stands in the torpedo bomber ready room, reviewing maps with his pilots. The briefing is tense. Every man present knows the operation is hours away. The radio silence has been absolute for 8 days. No communications with Tokyo, no messages from the fleet, nothing but the drone of engines and the crash of waves against the hull. Fuchida looks at the young pilots around him. Most are in their 20s. Some have combat experience from China. Most are about to participate in the largest naval airstrike in history, equipped with weapons they don't fully understand, using tactics that contradict everything conventional naval doctrine teaches. The water in Pearl Harbor averages 40 feet, Fuchida says, pointing to the map. Previous naval doctrine stated that torpedo attacks were impossible in such shallow water. We know differently. Our modified Type 91 torpedoes will function. They have been tested extensively. They will work. A younger pilot raises his hand. Sir, with respect, what if American air defenses are concentrated on the airfields? Fuchida interrupts. Intelligence indicates American fighters are parked wing to wing on the runways. They expect attack from conventional bombers. They do not expect torpedo planes in their harbor. They believe shallow water attacks are physically impossible. That belief will kill them. The pilot nods slowly, understanding. The entire strategic advantage rests on American ignorance. The moment the attack commences, that advantage evaporates. Speed and surprise are everything. First attack wave launches at our 600 hours tomorrow, Fuchida continues. 183 aircraft total, 50 torpedo bombers equipped with shallow water Type 91 torpedoes, 40 dive bombers with 250-kilogram ordnance, 49 level bombers carrying 800-kilogram armor-piercing bombs. We will execute the coordinated strike plan. Torpedo planes target Battleship Row. Dive bombers attack any carriers in port, though intelligence suggests American carriers are currently absent. Level bombers target repair facilities, supply depots, everything else. He pauses, allowing the weight of what he's about to say to settle over the room. We will achieve tactical surprise. The Americans will believe their harbor is protected by physics. We will prove them profoundly wrong. The window opens and begins closing. At 0600 hours on December 7, 1941, already December 8th in Honolulu, due to the international dateline, the first wave of Japanese aircraft launches from the carriers. Fuchida leads the strike in his Kate torpedo bomber, call sign Tora, Tiger. The weather begins improving as the task force approaches Hawaiian airspace. By 0700 hours, the rain and chaos have given way to clear skies. Visibility extends to 20 miles. The Japanese aircraft are detectable on American radar, but radar operators at Opana Station don't report them. The operators assume the radar is malfunctioning or that the aircraft are friendly B-17s expected to arrive that morning from the mainland. The American Pacific Fleet is completely unprepared. Battleship Row is visible from 30 miles away. 7 battleships anchored in the classic line formation designed to concentrate firepower while conserving valuable harbor space. USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, USS West Virginia, USS Tennessee, USS California, USS Maryland, USS Nevada. Hundreds of officers and enlisted men are still asleep. Some are having breakfast. Some are performing routine Sunday maintenance, unaware that their lives are measured in minutes. None of them believe their harbor is under attack. Fuchida radios the signal that will become immortal in history. Tora! 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 Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. The confirmation that tactical surprise has been achieved. The impossible becomes real. The 50 Type 91 torpedo bombers descend toward Battleship Row at 200 knots, releasing at 200 feet altitude exactly as trained. Each torpedo is equipped with Aoki's wooden tail fins. Each pilot trusts that the shallow water modification will function as designed. Each missile represents months of engineering triumph in Kagoshima Bay, months that are about to change the course of human history. The first torpedoes hit the water at 0755 hours. The wooden fins absorb impact. The 3-stage separation sequence executes exactly as calculated in 46 failed tests and 1 successful test. The torpedoes decelerate progressively through the water column, their trajectory flattening from 15-degree angles to 6-degree angles at the precise moment required for 40-foot harbor operations. The weapons level off at 35 to 40 feet depth, shallow enough to penetrate Pearl Harbor without difficulty, deep enough to travel horizontally toward their targets. The Americans watch in horror as the first explosions detonate. USS Arizona's port side is struck by a Type 91 torpedo at 0756 hours. The weapon penetrates the armor belt and detonates the ammunition magazine below decks. The explosion is so violent, it tears the battleship's bow completely off. The Arizona sinks in 9 minutes, taking 1,177 crew members to the bottom, nearly 50% of the total American deaths that day caused by a single weapon. USS Oklahoma is struck by 4 Type 91 torpedoes in rapid succession. Each torpedo functions perfectly in shallow water. The wooden fins do exactly what they were designed to do. The Oklahoma capsizes within 12 minutes, trapping hundreds of sailors inside the upturned hull, their screams muffled by tons of steel. USS West Virginia is struck by 7 torpedoes. The ship sinks in shallow water, but the crew manages to control the flooding enough to prevent complete loss. USS Tennessee, USS Maryland, and USS California are each struck by multiple torpedoes. The destruction is methodical and complete. The second wave of Japanese aircraft arrives at 0850 hours. Level bombers strike the destroyers, each 800-kilogram bomb capable of penetrating battleship armor. Dive bombers strike the repair facilities, the oil storage depot, the submarine dock. The destruction spreads across the entire harbor. Fires rage, explosions echo. Smoke rises in pillars 10,000 feet high. By 1,000 hours, what had seemed impossible at dawn has become devastatingly real. 4 battleships are sunk. 4 more are damaged. 2 cruisers are sunk. 3 destroyers are sunk. The naval balance of power in the Pacific has shifted completely toward Japan. Over 1,100 sailors are dead on the Arizona alone. Another 1,100 are scattered across the harbor in wreckage and fire. But the American aircraft carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, USS Saratoga, are not in Pearl Harbor. That single fact, that one variable Yamamoto's intelligence section could not control, will ultimately determine the entire outcome of the Pacific War. Without the carriers being destroyed, Yamamoto understands his victory is incomplete. Worse than incomplete. It is a victory that has awakened an enemy and failed to destroy the one weapon system that will eventually matter most. Yamamoto's realization. Aboard the Akagi, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo celebrates the successful completion of the first wave. But Admiral Yamamoto, observing from his command center, understands something that Nagumo does not. The attack was tactically perfect. The shallow water torpedoes functioned flawlessly. The element of surprise was total. The casualty infliction was devastating. But the 6-month advantage window, the strategic timer that had started ticking when Test 48 succeeded in February, just closed forever. Every piece of American salvage crews will recover from Pearl Harbor will carry evidence of the wooden tail fins. Every naval engineer who examines the wreckage will understand immediately. Shallow water torpedo attacks are possible. The moment that knowledge spreads, and it will spread instantly, every major navy on Earth will begin redesigning its harbor defenses. American shipyards will begin reinforcing their anchorages. New defensive measures will be implemented. The tactical advantage Japan has now achieved will evaporate like morning mist. Moreover, and this is what haunts Yamamoto, as Pearl Harbor burns, the attack has unified American political will in a way that nothing else could have. The Japanese attack, intended to destroy American strategic capacity, has done something far worse. It has unified American political will. The awakening of industrial giants. At 1400 hours on December 7, 1941, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt addresses the joint session of Congress. His words will echo through American history as one of the most consequential speeches of the 20th century. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The American people, hearing those words broadcast across the nation, understand immediately that war has come. Not the abstract possibility of war, not diplomatic maneuvering or political debate. Real war. War fought by Japanese weapons on American soil, destroying American ships, killing American sailors, wounding American civilians. The response will be total. The American industrial machine, the greatest manufacturing capacity on Earth, will be mobilized entirely toward one purpose: total victory over Japan. 800,000 workers will shift to war production. Factories will operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Shipyards will build new battleships, new carriers, new destroyers, new submarines at rates that will eventually overwhelm Japanese production capacity by more than 10 to 1. In 1942, American shipyards will produce 24 Essex-class fleet carriers. Japan will produce 5. In 1943, America will build 21 new battleships. Japan will build 2. By 1944, American factories will have produced 40,000 combat aircraft. Japan will have produced 12,000. Yamamoto, monitoring American industrial reports through intercepted intelligence, will watch this ratio grow with the cold certainty of a man observing the inevitable. Japan has won a battle. America is winning a war. Mitsuo Fuchida's final moment. Mitsuo Fuchida watches the devastation below as his aircraft banks away from Battleship Row toward the rendezvous point. Smoke rises in pillars 10,000 feet high. Fires burn across the harbor. American anti-aircraft fire is now intense, but the first-wave Japanese aircraft have already completed their attack runs and are departing toward safety. The tactical victory is overwhelming. The complete success of the shallow-water torpedoes has been proven beyond any doubt. Fuchida transmits the strike report. Attack successful. 4 battleships sunk. 4 battleships damaged. Multiple cruisers and destroyers damaged or sunk. Estimated 70% of American battleship striking power neutralized. Suggest immediate return to carriers for withdrawal. He doesn't know that the American carriers survived. That will haunt him for the rest of his life. The engineering victory that created strategic defeat. The brilliance of Fumio Aoki's engineering, the shallow-water torpedo modification, had made Pearl Harbor possible. That brilliance had just ensured that Japan's window of strategic advantage would last exactly 6 months before American countermeasures, American industrial capacity, and American determination would render the Japanese advantage meaningless. Aoki, listening to radio reports of the attack's success in a Tokyo naval facility, feels no triumph. He feels only the cold weight of realized consequences. He had solved the impossible physics problem. He had made shallow-water torpedo attacks feasible. He had given Japan the weapon to destroy the American Pacific Fleet. But in doing so, he had also set Japan on a path to total defeat. The wooden tail fins had changed naval warfare forever. They had changed the strategic balance of the entire Pacific War. They had made Pearl Harbor possible. But in making Pearl Harbor possible, they had awakened the American giant from its isolationist slumber and unified an entire nation behind total war mobilization. Japan now had 6 months, perhaps less, before American industrial capacity would transform the Pacific into a killing field where Japan's superior pilots and ship handling would be overwhelmed by sheer American abundance. The 6-month timer, which had begun when Test 48 succeeded in February 1941, was now actively running. December 7, 1941, was day 1 of Japan's final countdown. June 4, 1942. 10:25 hours, Midway Atoll. 200 nautical miles from the battle area, the 6-month timer Yamamoto understood so clearly has just run out. Over the Japanese fleet, American dive bombers from USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown are executing coordinated attacks against the Japanese carriers. At precisely 10:25 in the morning, within a 5-minute window that will change the entire course of the Pacific War, 3 Japanese carriers are struck simultaneously. The Akagi takes a single bomb hit that penetrates the flight deck and detonates in the hangar below. The explosion is cataclysmic. The Japanese carriers had been in the process of rearming their aircraft with bombs and torpedoes for a counterstrike against American forces. That ammunition, hundreds of bombs and torpedoes stacked in the hangars, ignites in a chain reaction. Fires spread through the ship with terrifying speed. Within minutes, the Akagi is engulfed in flames. The Kaga is struck by multiple bombs. 4 direct hits detonate the ammunition magazines. The fires are so intense that the crew abandons ship within an hour. The Soryu takes 3 bomb hits. The explosions are equally devastating. The carrier is sinking within minutes. In 5 minutes, just 300 seconds, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers are destroyed. The 4th carrier, the Hiryu, will launch a counterattack and damage the USS Yorktown, but will itself be sunk within hours by American dive bombers. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carrier force, watches his entire striking force, the naval aviation power that devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months ago, burn and sink beneath him. The 4 carriers that launched the attack that shocked the world are now gone. Exactly 6 months. To the day. The window closes, and history. Pivots aboard his flagship, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto receives reports of the carrier losses with the cold clarity of a man watching his entire strategic vision collapse in real time. The 6-month advantage window he had calculated so carefully in February 1941, the window that had started ticking when Test 48 succeeded, has ended precisely as he predicted. Pearl Harbor had been intended to destroy the American Pacific Fleet so comprehensively that America would be incapable of conducting offensive operations for at least 2 years. In those 2 years, Yamamoto believed Japan could consolidate territorial gains, create a defensive perimeter that would be too costly for America to penetrate, and force America into a negotiated peace. The plan had failed because the American carriers were not in Pearl Harbor. And now, 6 months later, those very carriers, the ships that Japan had failed to destroy, had just destroyed Japan's carrier force. The strategic calculus had inverted. Japan, which had enjoyed carrier superiority in December 1941, now faced a situation where American industrial capacity would build replacement carriers faster than Japan could replace losses. The mathematics of industrial war. In the 6 months between December 7, 1941 and June 4, 1942, the fundamental balance of power in the Pacific had shifted in ways that could never be reversed. American shipyards, mobilized for total war, had launched 24 new Essex-class fleet carriers. Japan, working with limited industrial capacity and damaged shipyards, had completed construction on exactly 2 new fleet carriers to replace combat losses. The mathematical disparity was not just significant, it was catastrophic. American factories, converted entirely to military production, had manufactured 13,000 new combat aircraft. Japan had produced 4,200. American defense contractors had built 7,000 new tanks, 40,000 trucks, and 300 merchant ships. American oil refineries were producing gasoline at rates that exceeded Japanese total industrial output across all categories. The American industrial machine, activated by the unified political will that Pearl Harbor had created, had become an unstoppable force. The Japanese, superior in pilot training and naval tactics, could still shoot down American aircraft at ratios of 3-to-1 or even 5-to-1. But they were losing aircraft and irreplaceable pilots faster than they could replace them. The American pilot replacement system rotated experienced pilots home to train new pilots, creating a sustainable cycle of pilot production and training. Japan, by contrast, kept veteran pilots in combat until they were killed, losing irreplaceable experience with every casualty. The shallow water torpedo had destroyed battleships. It had made Pearl Harbor tactically feasible. But it had not destroyed aircraft carriers, the weapon system that would ultimately determine the entire Pacific War. And by awakening American industrial capacity, the shallow-water torpedo had guaranteed that Japan's initial tactical advantage would become a strategic disaster. Fumio Aoki's reckoning. Fumio Aoki, working in a Tokyo naval research facility thousands of miles from Midway, receives reports of the carrier losses through official military channels. The Akagi is sunk. The Kaga is gone. The Soryu has been destroyed. The Hiryu, the flagship's sister carrier, is lost. 3,000 Japanese sailors are dead at Midway. Nearly 3,000 more have been killed in the preceding 6 months of tropical warfare, island hopping, and carrier engagements. Aoki, sitting alone in his laboratory, holds in his hands a technical drawing of the Type 91 torpedo with its distinctive 3-layer wooden tail fin assembly. The drawing is dated February 15, 1941, the day of Test 48. He stares at the wooden fin design, the engineering triumph that had seemed so brilliant just 18 months ago. He understands immediately. The shallow-water torpedo modification, his modification, had made Pearl Harbor possible. Pearl Harbor had awakened American industrial capacity. American industrial capacity had mobilized at a scale that Japan could not match. Japan's defeat was now inevitable. The weapon that was supposed to save Japanese lives by delivering a knockout blow to American naval power had instead become the catalyst for Japan's total defeat. Aoki sets down the drawing. His hands are shaking, not from age, he is only 52, but from the full weight of realized consequences. The bridge from triumph to catastrophe. What Fumio Aoki's engineering had created, what Test 48 had validated, was a bridge connecting triumph to catastrophe. The shallow-water torpedo had made Pearl Harbor tactically feasible. Pearl Harbor's tactical success had unified American political will with absolute determination. American political will had mobilized American industrial capacity at a scale unprecedented in human history. American industrial capacity had transformed the Pacific War into an industrial competition that Japan could not possibly win. Midway was not the cause of Japan's defeat. Midway was merely the moment when that defeat became mathematically inevitable. The failure of strategic vision. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto made an observation in his personal notes that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. "We have won a glorious victory at Pearl Harbor. We have destroyed American battleships and killed American sailors. But we have awakened an industrial giant. We have unified the American people behind total war mobilization. We have perhaps already lost the war that we thought we were winning." He paused before writing the final entry. "We need to achieve a negotiated peace with America within the next 6 months. If we do not consolidate our territorial gains and force America to the negotiating table before their industrial advantage becomes overwhelming, Japan is lost. We have won every tactical battle. But we are losing a strategic war that was decided the moment American industrial capacity came fully online. The shallow-water torpedo was brilliant engineering, but it solved the wrong problem. We destroyed battleships. We should have destroyed American industrial will. That we failed to do." Yamamoto would die in April 1943, shot down by American fighters over Bougainville, never knowing that his 6-month assessment was almost exactly correct. The window had been narrower than even he calculated. It had closed at Midway, exactly on schedule. The weaponization of desperation. By late 1942, as Japanese military planners understood that victory was no longer possible, the shallow-water torpedo was being used in a different context, not as an instrument of strategic advantage, but as a tool of tactical desperation. The same Type 91 torpedoes that had devastated Battleship Row in December 1941 were being loaded into Japanese aircraft, piloted by young men who understood they were flying suicide missions. The weapon that was supposed to win wars was now being used by pilots flying through American anti-aircraft fire with no reasonable expectation of survival, their aircraft deliberately being crash-landed into American ships as flying bombs. The tactical brilliance of Aoki's engineering had been perverted into the instrumentation of tactical desperation. A decision in the darkness. In late 1943, as American forces began island hopping across the Pacific, closing relentlessly toward the Japanese homeland, Fumio Aoki made a private decision. He would not survive the war as a bystander. He could not undo what he had created. The shallow water torpedo existed. It had changed naval warfare. It had made Pearl Harbor possible. The consequences were now irreversible. But he could bear witness. He could observe firsthand what his engineering innovation had unleashed. He could see the consequences of brilliant tactical engineering in the context of strategic defeat. Aoki volunteered for assignment to a forward naval liaison position in the Philippines. He knew what he was volunteering for. The Philippines were in the path of American island hopping. American forces would reach the Philippines in 1944, and when they did, the Japanese forces there would be surrounded, outnumbered, and eventually annihilated. He arrived in Manila in October 1944, just as American forces were beginning their assault on Philippine positions. For the next 6 months, Aoki observed. He watched Japanese pilots fly to their deaths. He watched naval bases be bombed into rubble. He watched the systematic destruction of Japanese military power, knowing with absolute certainty that his own engineering innovation had contributed, directly, specifically, to the situation Japan now faced. In March 1945, as American forces closed in on the final Japanese defensive positions in Manila, Fumio Aoki volunteered for a combat patrol. He was 56 years old. Combat engineers were not typically deployed to frontline positions. But Aoki's request was granted. He was killed in action on March 12, 1945, during the battle for Manila. His body was never recovered. He lies, presumably, in an unmarked grave somewhere in the ruins of Manila. The engineer who had solved the impossible physics problem, who had bent the laws of nature to accommodate strategy, who had created a weapon that changed history, dead in the country he had been trying to conquer. He died bearing witness to the consequences of his own brilliance. The bitter truth of Midway. The Battle of Midway told a story that would haunt Japanese military historians for generations. The 4 carriers that had launched the Pearl Harbor strike, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were gone. The shallow water torpedo modification had made their greatest tactical victory possible, but it had also made their greatest strategic defeat inevitable. 1 month after Midway, when salvage crews recovered pieces of the sunken Japanese carriers, American naval engineers studied the wreckage with intense interest. They found fragments of Type 91 torpedoes. They examined the distinctive wooden tail assemblies. American naval intelligence officers immediately understood what they were looking at: a sophisticated hydrodynamic design specifically engineered to enable shallow water operations. Within days, American naval designers began developing countermeasures. American warships would be repositioned. American harbor defenses would be reinforced. American naval doctrine would be revised. The tactical advantage that Japan had possessed, the 6-month window of shallow water torpedo dominance, was officially closed. The final calculation, the mathematics of the Pacific War, tell a story that would have been impossible to predict in February 1941 when Test 48 succeeded. The shallow water torpedo modification saved Japan approximately 4,000 pilot casualties in the Pearl Harbor attack. Pilots and aircraft that would have been lost in a failed conventional assault on the American fleet. But the attack on Pearl Harbor and the tactical victory it represented ultimately contributed to Japanese losses estimated at approximately 2.5 to 3 million military personnel and 1 to 2 million civilian casualties by the time Japan surrendered in August 1945. Aoki's engineering triumph had saved a few thousand lives in the short term. But in doing so, it had triggered a chain reaction that cost millions of Japanese lives. The weapon that was intended to save Japanese lives had instead become the catalyst for Japanese national devastation. The pilot's perspective. Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor strike with Tora Tora Tora, survived the war. He would be tried as a war criminal, but acquitted. He would eventually convert to Christianity and become a missionary. In interviews conducted in the 1960s and 1970s, Fuchida would reflect on the war with the perspective that only a survivor can achieve. "We achieved a great tactical victory at Pearl Harbor. Our pilots flew perfectly. Our torpedo bombers executed their attack runs with precision. The shallow water torpedo modification worked flawlessly. We destroyed 4 battleships and damaged 4 others. We killed over 1,100 American sailors on the USS Arizona alone. But on that same day, we lost the war. We awakened American political will. We gave them a unified sense of purpose. We mobilized American industrial capacity in ways that Japan could never hope to match. We were brilliant tactically, but we were catastrophic strategically. We won every tactical engagement at Pearl Harbor. We lost the strategic war that day. If I could go back in time, if I could speak to the planners of Pearl Harbor, I would tell them, do not attack Pearl Harbor, because the shallow water torpedo that made it possible will be the very weapon that ensures your defeat." The irony that cannot be escaped. The shallow water torpedo ultimately represented a fundamental failure of strategic vision. It was a weapon designed to solve a tactical problem, how to attack a fleet in shallow water, without considering the strategic implications, how to defeat an enemy whose industrial capacity dwarfed Japan's by a factor of 10. Japan had asked the wrong question. It had asked, how do we destroy the American Pacific Fleet? Japan should have asked, how do we defeat American industrial capacity? And to that second question, no tactical weapon, no matter how ingenious, no matter how revolutionary, could provide an answer. Legacy of wooden fins. When the war ended in August 1945, when Japan surrendered and the occupation began, the shallow water torpedo was studied extensively by American naval engineers. They were astonished by the sophistication of the design, by the elegance of the 3-stage separation sequence, by the engineering triumph that Aoki had achieved. American naval historians would later call it one of the most impressive engineering achievements of the war. But by then, no one was asking about engineering achievements. They were asking about why Japan had lost, why a nation that had produced such brilliant technical innovators had nonetheless been defeated so completely and so catastrophically. The answer was not about weapons. It was about industrial capacity, about political will, about the ability to wage total war against an enemy whose resources were effectively limitless. Fumio Aoki had solved the impossible problem of shallow water torpedo design. But he had not solved, could not have solved, the impossible problem of defeating a nation whose industrial capacity was 10 times larger than his own. The wooden tail fins had changed naval warfare forever. But they had not changed the outcome of the Pacific War. That outcome had been determined not by tactical brilliance, but by industrial reality.